Let's be honest. Villains have more fun. Hello, adventurers! I am the Welsh DM, the one Welshman whose accent got too tired practicing villain monologues in the mirror. Villains are pretty much at the core of everything we do when it comes to tabletop RPGs. Whether it's the cackling lich animating undead armies, the cruel king looking to expand their territory and punish those who stand against them, or simply a red dragon burning down villages. But in a world of actual plays, epic stories like Critical Role, Dimension 20 or Legends of Evantris, it can become quite intimidating, like a weight of expectation is put upon us as GMs to create very deep, very compelling villains. I mean, what if they're not interesting enough? What if my players don't care about what they're doing? What if my players ask so many questions about where they came from and I don't have those answers? All of these questions and more can come up when we're trying to write our villains for our players at the table, between the villains themselves, their goals, their emotions, and many much more things besides. But honestly, I don't think it matters. For us as home game GMs, we need to be okay with having an okay villain. We don't need to have this vast wealth of knowledge or an interconnected network of spies across the land. We just need a compelling villain that our players will learn to hate, and maybe has a fun voice as well. So in this entry on how to be an okay GM, we're going to focus on villains and what it takes to make a pretty good one for your table. Because sometimes it's okay to be good enough, even when you're trying to take over the world. Step 1 to building a villain your players will love to hate, or just love for the weirdos out there, is figuring out who or what they are. There are all sorts of options out there, from a simple monster threatening the village like a dragon or a pack of harpies, to something more manipulative like a devil seeking to sow corruption and discord. Or maybe less fantastical, a cruel king who seeks to expand his territory and punish those who stand against him. What's important when you're deciding this is figuring out the kind of villain that you're going to enjoy embodying, because that's kind of your role as the GM. So, do you like the simplicity of a villain who is evil for the sake of evil? Do you prefer a monster that just sows destruction because it's its nature, it doesn't necessarily have morals? Or do you prefer that conniving, behind-the-scenes manipulative type that'll force your players into moral quandaries? All of these are great options, but it's about which one inspires you as the GM and makes you want to be that villain in the narrative. And I think that's the key here. It's about what inspires you. Because if you're excited about a villain, there's a good chance you'll be able to get your players excited about them too. There's all manner of ways to become inspired. Maybe you recently read a book or watched a TV show with a particularly interesting villain that you want to see how it translates to the table. My personal favourite is flicking through something like the Monster Manual and waiting to be inspired by a certain piece of art or stat block that I can then work backwards from to build the story up to that climactic final encounter. There's also stuff like the Bestiary series on this channel that does deep dives into specific monsters and the stories you can tell with them that might give you some ideas. And don't forget about the world you are choosing to play in as well. Are you in a world filled with political factions constantly vying for power and one-upping each other? Or in a post-apocalyptic wasteland full of deadly, corrupted monsters? This will shape the kind of villain that makes sense for the adventure you're telling. It just might help narrow things down for you. And lastly, don't forget about the other people at the table when you're deciding on your villain. What sort of villain do your players want to fight? This is the perfect kind of discussion point that comes up in a session 0. Sometimes people just want to turn up, roll some dice, fight some monsters, and turn their brain off for the night. In those instances, a red dragon or a gang of hobgoblins might do perfectly. But if you've agreed to a campaign full of moral quandaries and tough decisions, then a dragon that's just seeking to amass more gold for its hoard probably isn't going to cut it. So too, consider the types of characters your players are playing. It's not necessary for the villain to be a direct foil or counterpunch to your players, but it can help where they have certain traits that will encourage your players to oppose them when they come across them. It's a little tropey, but tropes exist for a good reason. At a bare minimum, make sure that the monster or type of villain that you pick allows your players' characters chances to shine, or at least doesn't take away from their core identity. If you've got a party full of wizards, don't run a villain that's immune to magic. With your villain decided, it's now time for the important question. What do they want? This is going to be the crux of your adventure because it's going to introduce conflict, and conflict is what makes stories. So, taking the concept of your villain, consider what they might want, and crucially why that is in opposition to what the player characters might want themselves. Your goal should be trying to find something that the player characters will instantly want to rebel against and prevent from happening. Otherwise, you're just going to spend half your adventure trying to convince your players to stop the villain at all. This doesn't mean you have to create your villain and their goals after character creation, but it can help to leave their goal vague enough that you can connect in the characters that the players have chosen. What does this look like? If we take the Cruel King concept I mentioned before, perhaps what they want is to invade the nearby Dwarven Kingdom to get access to their mithril mines. This is particularly great if you have a druid in the party who doesn't want to see the land exploited by an egomaniac, or maybe just a dwarf in the party who hails from that kingdom and wants to defend their home. Maybe you have a knight like a paladin in the party who is sworn to the service of the king and now has to weigh up their morals against their duty. Alternatively, perhaps you've chosen a devil as your villain, and their goal is to corrupt the high priest of the church in the town the party are from, because their soul will be particularly valuable. Any holy characters in your party will possibly be connected to this church and therefore want to stop that, or maybe you have a wizard in the party who is interested in fiends and will use this as an opportunity to study them further. And if none of this is working for you, you can always try the good intentions taken too far trope. Particularly good if you want to play a kind of adventure that focuses on morals. Basically, you have your antagonists start with good intentions but kind of lose their way along the path and become too extreme to justify it. I did this with Amhrain in Unrolled Stories on this channel, where their original concept of regrowing the ancient forest is arguably a noble one, but the way they went about it led to them becoming a villain. Ultimately, the key to your adventure is going to be about figuring out what your villain wants and building a story around it. Keep true to that core goal and then use it to inspire side quests and small objectives that the players can directly interact with. You don't need a super complex 20-step supervillain plan. Really, if you have one good idea and keep circling back to it, it'll work pretty well for 9 out of 10 tables. Okay, you've got your villain, you know what they want, but how are they going about it? Well, you can't literally narrate the villain's actions every session, because that'll be quite boring for your players who are there to play their own characters, not listen to you play yours. So, we make them do things off screen. This is the easiest way for your villain to feel real and for your story to be dynamic. By doing this, the world feels like it's in motion and the story is progressing and not just waiting for the players to turn up. The villain should absolutely be doing their own adventuring at the same pace as the players. Often your players won't see these actions, but they'll feel the impact of them when they come across the aftermath. Simple things like gathering magic items, recruiting new followers, researching in old libraries, or even just studying the party themselves. And yes, all of this applies even to the simple big monster at the bottom of a dungeon. You don't have them waiting in the room for the players to turn up, they're moving around, they're taking actions. I feel this is a great thing to be doing away from the table and even away from when you're sitting down to do session prep. You can just be idly thinking about what the villain is up to and what steps they're taking to achieve their final goal. Especially when your players have recently done stuff to thwart their actions and they have to replan. If you want a slightly more advanced tip, I would recommend getting yourself a calendar to track in-world days and plan things ahead of time. Personally, I like fantasycalendar.com, but even a real-world calendar will suffice. The point is, you can use this calendar to plan events in the world and forecast the villain's own efforts, and therefore understand the impact of side quests, long rests, and travel time. You can say that if the players don't achieve X by a certain date, then the villain gets to do Y and further along their own goals. This is great for having the players see the consequences of their own actions and feel like they're meaningful, having an impact in the villain's own agenda, highlighting that their choices matter and the world is changed by them. Of course, don't overly plan these events. I would recommend only really going about a week ahead of schedule if you've got solid ideas, and leaving everything else much more malleable and able to react to the players' actions. You don't want to risk your players feeling like they're along for the ride because you've planned out 6 months of in-world play. Now, despite everything I just said in the last 3 sections, the actual most important part about your villain is how your players interact with them at the table. Don't get me wrong, that away from the camera stuff is great for making the world feel alive, but ultimately the story is told and experienced by the players in the moment at the table. We need to make sure that we're going to be comfortable and confident role-playing the villain in the scene. I personally like finding a piece of art or a song or something along those lines that helps me reframe my mind into that of the villain and get inspired and attached to who they are as a person. But for you, it could be putting on that really ostentatious large piece of jewellery that you own, or playing a particular theme song when they enter the scene, or maybe you pick up your cat and begin to stroke it in your lap like a Bond villain. Whatever it takes to put you in the frame of mind of being the antagonist, the evil character in the story. By the way, this kind of stuff is also perfect for players to get into the headspace of their character. I recommend going and checking out Ginny D, who has loads of videos like this. For me though, the hardest thing when it comes to portraying my villain is disassociating and willingly becoming that evil person. And you know what? That's fine. I'm not a method actor or a professional GM. I just do this for fun, and maybe I don't want to explore that side of me that becomes evil. That being said, it is useful to try and get as close as I can to make the scene feel real for my players. So it's important to consider the traits and personality of the villain and through their actions showcase their morals rather than through my own words at the table. Are they a merciless cutthroat? Then use their actions to pick on wounded characters or put innocent lives in danger. Alternatively, maybe they're a manipulative, cruel person that will force the party to choose between the lesser of two evils. And then there's their actions in combat as well. Does the villain choose to spend the lives of their minions freely so they can escape? Or do they prefer to wade into battle themselves and show off their strength and prowess? Maybe instead they're manipulative and tactical, figuring out how to separate the party and weaken one side to weaken the collective whole. Ultimately, this all feeds back into the very start of this video where we figured out what kind of villain we were going to be using for our adventure. In the video on running combat in this series, I mentioned about the fact that roleplay doesn't end just because initiative was rolled. We want to maintain the mood and tone of the villain through combat, jibing with the players and continuing to keep up the facade of fiction. Give yourself a chance to do that dramatic villain monologue you've always wanted to do. After all, the villain is kind of like your character, and it's okay to take the spotlight away from your players every now and again. And the last piece I'll say on this matter is hold loosely onto your villains. You may have grand plans for them, but sometimes the dice and the players say differently. Be okay with your boss being defeated earlier than planned. And you can always just find a bigger fish that was the villain's patron that now has their eyes on the party. Look, at the end of the day, it's important to remember that the villain's role in the story is to be defeated. Fall in love with your villain, yes, but fall in love with their ending more. Be excited to see the creative way your players will defeat them. Give your villain exploitable weaknesses. This could just be a big glowing red button that they have to hit with swords, but it can also be character flaws or big gaping holes in their grand plans. It is easier than you think to make a compelling villain for your friends at the table. You don't need a huge backstory or traumatic origin to create a villain that they want to stop. Look, if you're ever in doubt, just remember the two-question premise. It's a premise I heard about in relation to Star Trek, specifically about how adults that are buying into the fiction of a story aren't going to ask more than two questions as to how or why something exists in the world. For Star Trek, it was the how does the Enterprise travel faster than light? Well, it has a warp drive. Okay, how does the warp drive work? Well, it has dilithium crystals. And that's it. That's enough for the fiction of the world to get going and dive into the actual story you're trying to tell. This applies to our villains just as well. Why is the cruel king wanting to invade the Dwarven Kingdom? To get the mithril mines. Well, why do they want the mithril mines? He's planning on building a mithril construct to protect his capital. Good enough, the players now know and are willing to go and do the actions needed to stop him. Or something like, why does the villain's lair have a sewer that leads directly into the ritual chamber? Well, the ritual needs to be able to flush away components really easily. Okay, and why is it not defended? Well, the villain's too busy thinking about and designing their grand ritual to think about the architecture of their lair. In a world of internet discussions, Reddit forums, and Wikipedia entries for the entirety of Critical Role, it's occasionally easy to forget we don't need that deep lore to tell fun, dramatic stories with our friends. Remember, your game isn't going to be picked apart and shipped by teenagers on Tumblr, it's just going to be discussed by you and your friends on a Friday night. All you need to know is who your villain is, what do they want, and how are they going to try and get it. And beyond that, your players will respond to the actions you take in the moment, and they'll respond in kind. So just make sure you're taking obvious, deliberate actions with your villains that your party can respond to. And while you're doing it, make sure to listen to your players' theories, because I guarantee you a table of 5 people will come up with a better idea as to what the villain's actually up to than you will in your office on a Sunday night desperately scribbling in a notebook. Anyway, I do believe that's it. I certainly hope you now feel capable of portraying a pretty decent villain for your next adventure. If you have run a particularly memorable villain or have some other advice for other OK GMs out there, feel free to drop a comment below. I try to make sure I reply to every comment on there, and I'm looking forward to seeing what you have to say. And if you enjoyed this video, why not give it a like and then go check out all the other videos in the OK GM series. But I think that's enough villain talk for now. So, until we do this again, you keep an eye out for dragons. I'm going to go try and redeem my accent. And remember to keep telling stories.